Good morning, everybody. This is your friend, Mr. Hargesheimer. I apologize that I'm unable to come to you at a live Google Meet, but I will be going over the same material. We are going to be working on the Industrial Revolution for the week coming up, and you will be deciding whether or not industrialization improved people's lives, which means we'll be looking at some information for and against that argument. You will be doing that in the form of a web quest, which means I will give you some links to some sites to look up information. That you are on the Loom website currently. It tracks who logs in, and it also tracks the amount of time you spend watching the video. So this is how I'm going to track attendance. Please sit through the entire video. It's not like you're going anywhere. So we are going to be looking at, did industrialization improve people's lives? So the Industrial Revolution web quest you'll have next week, it's just going to be providing you with background information about the Industrial Revolution, what happened during that time period. So you're going to have, as we usually do, a claim with two examples from any of the sites you use in the web quest, and an explanation about how the evidence fits your claim. You have some possible responses to this. I'm trying to anticipate. It could be a little bit more in this, but we shall see what you come up with. You could say, yes, the technology made people's lives easier, goods cheaper, moved us along as a society. You could say no. A lot of this technology made people's lives harder, moving away from family farms, having their labor exploited, that sort of thing. You could have a maybe. It improved the lives of some groups, but not all. And then you would be giving me examples of what those meant. Your scoring guide is going to be determined by whether or not you have a clear claim, whether or not you have evidence from two of these sources at least, and this evidence should be cited and described, which means you're going to give an example of the evidence word for word from one of the sites or documents, and then you're going to say what that means. And your reason, again, should very clearly connect how that evidence goes back to your claim. And if you should be able to include this in your digital backpack of success skills, either as an effective communicator or a globally and culturally competent citizen. So this exact same slide here will be on the document I'm providing you guys next week, so you won't have to come back to this. So we will start with what is called the market revolution, which is going to be a change in society from agriculture, and that being the basis for economy, farming, to urban factory-based economy. And by urban, I mean people concentrated in cities. And we're looking at the time here, it's a longer kind of stretch of time. This is going to start the late 1700s all the way up through almost the time of the Civil War. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, most labor was organized around a self-sufficient family. Most of the work was farming. You had to produce your own medicine. If you traded, you did that yourself. If you had to make tools, shoes, textiles like clothing, all that was led by the head of the household. Many instances that would have been the father, and it was all done at home. The big change is for industrial labor. It's going to be organized around unskilled or semi-skilled labor. So compared to being able to make a pair of shoes, being able to tie knots in a carpet or to sew one part of a shirt, it's a different level of skill. It's much less. You only have to know one thing instead of knowing the entire variety of things to be self-sufficient. Work is no longer centered around the home. It moves into factories and mills, and wealth that is created is not concentrated or stays in the family. It moves out to the owners of the factories, and it's based on cheap and efficient production and exploitation of the workers. And by exploitation, I mean that the amount of wealth that a worker produces has to be more than the worker takes home. The surplus wealth is what goes to the owner. So I will be talking you through the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, some important people that are in there, the American system, because the laws and policies of the United States are going to go a long way towards promoting this. And then we'll look at how transportation changed. And then we'll look at changes in labor and some effects on the environment. So the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. It started with a man named Richard Arkwright, who in 1769 invented the water frame, which used semi-skilled labor and water power to make thread. You go near a river, you put your factory near a river. As the water wheel turns, it creates power through which machines can produce this thread, which is what he started at. So he started to build the first textile mills in England, and this led a man named Samuel Slater to tour his factories. So he worked in one of the mills, and he went around to a lot of different mills, and he memorized the design, and then he moved to the U.S. to build his own. So he was the first spy in industry. He completely stole the idea from Richard Arkwright and then moved it to the U.S. And also at the same time, there was a man named Eli Whitney who came up with the idea, and this was in a gun-making factory, of interchangeable parts. So machine tools would make a part. And he started with guns. So let's say you have a rifle. One part of the rifle breaks. You don't have to buy an entirely new rifle. An interchangeable part, different parts fit the same machine. Prior to that, when each individual family or worker in a town or city was making the parts, they may not all necessarily fit each other. Everyone would have been slightly different. So this allowed, instead of throwing out an entire product, you only had to change part of it. And also the idea that splitting up labor among separate people to get a job done. And this is called division of labor. We've done this one before. We have also talked about the American system, which was promoted by Henry Clay, who was from Kentucky. He was part of the Whig Party, and this was one of their big platforms to increase industrial labor or industrial wealth in the United States. And there were three basic parts for doing this. The first being to pass high tariffs or taxes on imports. And imports are things that were coming in at the end of the War of 1812, when there was the Treaty of Ghent, that's a peace agreement between England and the United States. Trade began to move back and forth again. So Clay and the Whig Party had the idea of taxing this trade as it came in, and then using that extra money to reestablish the Bank of the United States that we talked about earlier with Alexander Hamilton, whose charter expired in 1811, and to have a national currency would be a way to stabilize or make it more secure. Like, you would know what a dollar was worth in Georgia and in Massachusetts. And lastly, to use this money in the bank to give loans to people to start businesses. You would also use the money, the government would, to construct roads, construct canals, increased transportation. And the map that I have on the side here is just where in the early 1800s, canals, railroads, roads were built. So one of the big parts of this American system was transportation, and that led to what is known as the Transportation Revolution. So let's start with roads. There was a national or a Cumberland Road that was constructed in 1817. It went from Maryland to Wheeling, West Virginia. It was made entirely of crushed rocks. And this would have been hand labor for people to dig out an area for the road, to clear stumps. It went through the mountains between Maryland and Wheeling, West Virginia, the Appalachian Mountains. So this was a big undertaking, even though it went to between two very small areas and over a small part of the U.S. There were also canals. The largest structure that was made at the time and dug entirely by hand was the Erie Canal. It was 363 miles long, and it connected Albany with Buffalo, New York. And this waterway allowed farmers to more easily get their goods to markets and even more markets. It lowered the cost of transportation, where you would have to maybe have a wagon take something over a long period of time. So shipping in this way had gone from $100 a ton all the way down to $8 a ton just through the Erie Canal. And so having more markets and having a cheaper way to get there spurred some farming in that region to improve. One of the big ones was railroads. One of the first ones was the B&O Railroad in Maryland. And in 1830, there was a guy named Robert Livingston Stevens, and he designed an iron or T-shaped rail. And so the railroads, based on his design, grew from 3,000 to 30,000 miles of railroads in only 20 years. Initially, railroads were really expensive, and they were built very quickly, which caused a lot of accidents. And different companies would have used different types of tracks, so you couldn't connect the railroads. Only certain trains would run on certain tracks. So Livingston's design allowed for the railroads to cover a larger area and to connect a lot of different areas. So these were all big benefits for working Americans, farmers. It created jobs. So this was a big boon in the United States. Labor at the time. By 1830, because these mills that I mentioned earlier were based on exploitation or getting the most out of workers, you had to have a workforce that could work cheaply. So by 1830, about 80% of the workforce in these textile mills, or mills where they made clothing, they were women. They lived in dorms near the factory. They worked long hours. One of the first inventions of the Industrial Revolution was the clock. And instead of the sun rising and setting to set your day, it became based on a clock, and everyone had to be there at the same time and work in these factories. Also, by 1830, about 50% of the mill workers were under 16. So a large group of these women, a lot of boys, were all underage. Out of that group, I believe about 25% were under the age of 14. So we're talking about, in some instances, very young children. Some of the early ones would have been kids 6, 7 years old, doing some of the labor around these factories. After 1830, it became cheaper for immigrants to do these unskilled jobs. They showed up from countries they were pushed out of for economic reasons or wars. They would have been uneducated, unskilled, desperate for work. which made it easier to pay them lower wages. So you could have an adult male that could do more labor than a child or a very young girl, and you could pay them less. So they began to replace the women and children in the factories. And at the time, the slave system was still was actually starting to grow quite a bit because the economy of the U.S. became centered around the Northeast and these textile mills, and a lot of the resources that they needed, cotton primarily, uh, enslaved people were forced to pick and process to send north. So if you needed more cotton for these mills, which move things more efficiently and more quickly, then you needed more workers. And the way that they did it at the time was through enslavement. And again, that's another way to keep the price of producing things low and more money in the owner class. And to give you an idea of what life would have been like for these people in the mills, I'm going to read to you an excerpt from a letter from Mary Paul. She was a Lowell mill girl, and this is from 1845. Dear Father, I received your letter on Thursday the 14th with much pleasure. I am well, which is one comfort. My life and health are spared while others are cut off. Last Thursday, one girl fell down and broke her neck, which caused instant death. She was going in or coming out of the mill and slipped down, it being very icy. The same day, a man was killed by the railroad cars. Another had nearly all of his ribs broken. Another was nearly killed by falling down and having a bale of cotton fall on him. Last Tuesday, we were paid. In all, I had $6.60, paid $4.68 for board, and board is to be able to live there. With the rest, I got me a pair of rubbers, which would have been boots, and a pair of 50-cent shoes. Next payment, I am to have $1 a week beside my board. So you work at a factory, you live in a dorm at the factory, and they pay you, and then they immediately take back out rent for you to live near there. And the girl went on in the letter saying, oh, if anyone needs work, this is a good place to sign up. Even though from that passage, it obviously does not sound like a good place to sign up. So this labor force or change in labors is going to bring about a shift in American culture, which I would like to talk about. So we're looking at some of the boarding houses here and some of the conditions people work, but it's going to be a big change in the case I would like to talk about is labor relations and women's rights. So Samuel Slater, who I mentioned earlier, started what was called the Rhode Island system. He hired the entire families, and because of this division of labor thing that was innovated earlier, he divided the work into easy tasks. So a whole family would move near this factory. It was a water wheel factory for textiles. They built houses. They had a company store. They paid with store credit. So you had to work for long hours during the day. You had to pay them back for living there. And you got paid in what was called store credit. So you couldn't spend that anywhere outside the company store. So if you're the company, you hire people, they work, you get their money back through providing them a place to live, and the only place they can spend whatever money they have left is at your store. There was also the Lowell system in Massachusetts, started by Francis Cabot Lowell, who you will also be looking up in your WebQuest. He hired primarily young single women. So the mill girl that I read the letter from, she was a Lowell mill girl. And he also had textile mills. He encouraged education, but he also had the women work long hours, and a lot of them had health problems. And so a big change is going to be this organization of workers in the 1840s. There are trade unions, which are groups of workers that work together to try to improve pay and working conditions. And a lot of times the courts, so if the workers tried to sue or the workers tried to protest, the local courts or the local police would support the company and the owners, and they would come in and they would break strikes. The courts would always side with the companies. So the early worker organizations had a lot of problems. An example would be in Rhode Island, in this Rhode Island system earlier in 1824. There was the conditions were bad, as I mentioned earlier, about people being injured, having long hours. So the workers walked off. They left their looms when the mill owners announced that they were going to cut their pay even more. So they refused to return to work. They united with other factory workers, a lot of them children, groups of men, as well as local farmers and local workers. So in this Pawtucket, Rhode Island village, there were like 8 mills, and they all went on strike and blocked the doors. And so for an entire week, no work got done. The workers marched to the mill owners' houses, throwing rocks at their, breaking windows, that sort of thing. So what started with this group of women became a big movement, and they got their wages back. So that's a big change. In 1844, Lowell Female Labor Reform Association by Sarah G. Bagley was formed. There was a big turnout, what was called a turnout. This was the Pawtucket, Rhode Island one I just talked about. It was organized entirely by women. So this is one of the first big movements where it empowered women. Another big change would be changes in the environment. And this is going to be the last one I'd like to talk about. So these factories, they required the use of machines, and they also required that a large labor force live nearby. This necessitated the growth of cities, people all living in crowded areas. So these factories, because they're using machines, and at a certain point they started to move from water to burning coal to produce to run the machines. So they produced horrible smells, smoke, dust. Sometimes the fumes coming from the things they produced were poisonous. There was constant loud noise and repetitive pounding from these giant old machines. Families in nearby farms were sick. Their crops were killed. Their livestock died because a lot of the pollution, a lot of the runoff, a lot of the chemicals that they were using to treat things and to build things, and the oils to run the machines, they just dumped into the rivers nearby, and they went down and polluted the farms, killing people, making people sick, killing the animals, killing crops. Also, the crowding in these neighborhoods and these dorms and the places where the workers for the factories lived made them like really filthy places. People had poor diets, again, because they only had access to what the company provided. There was poor sanitation because there's not really a lot of money for a factory into building really clean facilities. You save money by having people live in poor conditions. And this overcrowding, these poor diets, and this poor sanitation led to poor public health. So they didn't have sewer systems because these cities grew so fast, and they didn't have access to clean drinking water. Usually the sewage was just washed out into the streets, and eventually made its way into the rivers, which contaminated the local water, which in turn they had to drink, or as I mentioned before, um, nearby farms had to use that for crops and things. So these are the areas that you're going to be looking at next week on your web quest. And I hope that everybody has a fantastic weekend. And I'm looking forward, hopefully, to see you guys again very soon.